In 1944, the United States Army Air Forces were secretly testing an aircraft so radical, so structurally unstable, that the engineers who built it quietly debated whether any pilot should be allowed to fly it at all. It wasn't German, wasn't captured, it was American. And for decades, the full story of what happened at Muroc Army Airfield in the California desert was kept far from the public record. This is not a story about victory. It's a story about desperation, ambition, and the price paid when a nation races against time to leap an entire generation ahead in aviation technology. By 1943, the strategic picture for Allied air power was complicated. American bomber crews flying B-17s and B-24s over occupied Europe were suffering catastrophic losses. The Luftwaffe's piston engine fighters, the Focke-Wulf 190 and Messerschmitt 109, were extracting a brutal toll. But intelligence reports filtering back to Washington carried something even more alarming. Germany was developing jet-powered aircraft. The Messerschmitt 262 program was accelerating. And American engineers and military planners understood with cold clarity that if Germany fielded operational jet fighters in large numbers before the Allies developed a counter, the air war over Europe could shift in ways no bombing campaign could correct. The U.S. response was not a single program. It was several, running in parallel, some openly documented, others deliberately obscured. Among the least discussed was the work being conducted around the Northrop Corporation and the broader American push into flying wing and mixed propulsion experimental platforms. Aircraft that pushed the boundaries of what was structurally and aerodynamically understood at the time. Some of those programs produced aircraft that flew, failed, were quietly grounded, and then disappeared from official conversation for years. What follows is the documented history of one of those efforts centered on the Northrop XP-79B, a flying wing rocket-powered interceptor that represents one of the most audacious and ultimately tragic American experimental programs of the Second World War. Title: The experimental aircraft the Pentagon buried for decades, Hook. In 1944, the United States Army Air Forces were secretly testing an aircraft so radical, so structurally unstable, that the engineers who built it quietly debated whether any pilot should be allowed to fly it at all. It wasn't German, wasn't captured, was American. And for decades, the full story of what happened at Muroc Army Airfield in the California desert was kept far from the public record. This is not a story about victory. It's a story about desperation, ambition, and the price paid when a nation races against time to leap an entire generation ahead in aviation technology. Introduction. By 1943, the strategic picture for Allied air power was complicated. American bomber crews flying B-17s and B-24s over occupied Europe were suffering catastrophic losses. The Luftwaffe's piston engine fighters, the Focke-Wulf 190 and Messerschmitt 109, were extracting a brutal toll. But intelligence reports filtering back to Washington carried something even more alarming. Germany was developing jet-powered aircraft. The Messerschmitt 262 program was accelerating. And American engineers and military planners understood with cold clarity that if Germany fielded operational jet fighters in large numbers before the Allies developed a counter, the air war over Europe could shift in ways no bombing campaign could correct. The U.S. response was not a single program. It was several running in parallel, some openly documented, others deliberately obscured. Among the least discussed was the work being conducted around the Northrop Corporation and the broader American push into flying wing and mixed propulsion experimental platforms. Aircraft that pushed the boundaries of what was structurally and aerodynamically understood at the time. Some of those programs produced aircraft that flew, failed, were quietly grounded, and then disappeared from official conversation for years. What follows is the documented history of one of those efforts centered on the Northrop XP-79B, a flying wing rocket-powered interceptor that represents one of the most audacious and ultimately tragic American experimental programs of the Second World War. Main story: Jack Northrop had a vision that most of his contemporaries considered impractical at best and dangerous at worst. He believed the future of aviation was the flying wing, an aircraft with no conventional fuselage. No tail assembly, just a clean, swept form that merged structure and lift into a single, unified shape. In theory, it was aerodynamically brilliant. In practice, it was extraordinarily difficult to stabilize and control. Northrop had been developing flying wing concepts throughout the late 1930s. And by the time the war accelerated every aviation program in America, he had the attention and the contracts of the Army Air Forces. The XP-79 program began under a specific and unusual tactical concept. The Army Air Forces wanted an interceptor that could climb to altitude faster than anything currently flying, reach enemy bombers before they completed their runs, and, if necessary, use the aircraft itself as a weapon, ramming the tail sections of German bombers with reinforced leading edges. This wasn't speculation. It was a documented design requirement. The XP-79 was built with thick magnesium alloy leading edges precisely to survive such an impact. Whether that tactic was ever seriously intended for operational use remains debated among historians. But the structural specifications were real. The original XP-79 design called for rocket propulsion, specifically the Aerojet 2000L B-thrust JTOW rocket motor system. Northrop's team worked at their Hawthorne, California facility under considerable pressure. The pilot would fly in a prone position, lying face down in the aircraft, configuration chosen to allow the fuselage profile to remain as flat and aerodynamically clean as possible, and theoretically to help the pilot withstand higher G-forces by distributing them across the body rather than concentrating them at the spine and lower extremities. It sounds almost reasonable until you consider the practical reality. A pilot lying prone in a rocket-powered flying wing, trying to manage a highly unstable platform at high altitude with control surfaces that no one had tested at speed. The rocket-propelled XP-79 never reached a successful test flight. Development difficulties with the propulsion system and severe instability issues led the Army Air Forces to make a critical decision in 1944. The rocket motors were abandoned. The airframe concept was preserved, but the propulsion was changed entirely. The result was a redesignated aircraft, the XP-79B, now powered by two Westinghouse J-30 centrifugal flow turbojet engines, each producing approximately 1,150 pounds of thrust. It was America's attempt to marry the flying wing concept to jet propulsion, and it was being developed at exactly the moment when the nation most needed answers about what jet aviation could and couldn't do. The sole XP-79B prototype was constructed and transported to Muroc Army Airfield, the remote, classified test site in the Mojave Desert that would eventually become Edwards Air Force. Base Muroc was chosen precisely because of its isolation. Vast dry lake beds provided natural runways. The terrain kept curious eyes away. And the Army Air Forces had learned, watching German programs through intelligence channels, that secrecy in experimental aviation was not a bureaucratic preference. It was a strategic necessity. The aircraft that sat on the lakebed at Muroc in the autumn of 1945 was unlike anything most of the ground crew had seen. It had a wingspan of roughly 38 feet, no tail, no vertical stabilizers in any conventional sense. The flying wing configuration gave it a profile that seemed almost alien against the flat desert horizon. The magnesium alloy construction kept weight down, but introduced its own complications. Magnesium is notoriously difficult to weld, and it burns with a fire that water cannot extinguish. The engineers at Northrop knew this. It informed every decision about how the aircraft was handled on the ground. The man chosen to fly the XP-79B was Harry Crosby, a Northrop test pilot with experience on unconventional aircraft. Crosby was not a military pilot in the traditional sense. He was a company test pilot, the kind of man whose job existed precisely at the intersection of engineering, courage, and controlled risk. On September 12, 1945, weeks after the end of the war in the Pacific, Crosby took the XP-79B into the air over Muroc for the first and only time. The flight lasted 15 minutes. What happened during those 15 minutes has been pieced together from ground observer reports and the subsequent accident investigation. Shortly after takeoff, the aircraft entered an uncontrolled rolling motion. Crosby attempted to recover. The aircraft did not respond in the way its design predicted. Whether this was a control system failure, stability issue inherent to the flying wing configuration at speed, or some combination of both, the investigation could not definitively determine. The XP-79B continued its roll, became inverted, and entered a spin from which recovery was impossible. Crosby attempted to bail out. In a prone position cockpit, the geometry of egress under those conditions was catastrophically difficult. He was struck by the aircraft and killed. The XP-79B impacted the desert floor and was destroyed. The program ended that afternoon. There was no second prototype. There was no combat deployment. There was no production run. The XP-79B existed as a single aircraft, flew once, and was gone. What makes this story more than a simple accident report is what the program represented and what came after it, or rather, what didn't. The Northrop flying wing concept didn't die at Muroc in September 1945. Jack Northrop continued to develop the idea throughout the late 1940s, producing the YB-35 and the jet-powered YB-49 strategic bomber, a magnificent and deeply troubled aircraft that flew beautifully under certain conditions and remained chronically unstable under others. The YB-49 program was eventually canceled in favor of the Convair B-36, a decision that Northrop believed involved factors beyond pure technical merit. He would carry that conviction for the rest of his life. But during the war years, the XP-79 program existed within a larger American anxiety about falling behind technologically. The Army Air Forces were simultaneously managing the Bell P-59 Aerocomet, America's first jet aircraft, which flew in October 1942 and proved deeply disappointing in performance, and accelerating the Lockheed P-8O Shooting Star program, which would become the first American jet to approach operational combat readiness. Against that backdrop, the XP-79 represented a different kind of bet. Not an incremental improvement, but a conceptual leap. A flying wing interceptor with rocket or jet power that could theoretically render conventional aircraft obsolete. The bet failed. But the failure carried information. Every crashed prototype, every aborted program, every flight that ended in the desert or in a lake bed contributed to a body of knowledge that the next generation of engineers would use. The prone pilot position was studied and ultimately judged impractical for high-performance military aircraft. The flying wing's instability at speed was documented, quantified, and eventually addressed decades later through computer-assisted flight control systems that didn't exist in 1945. The Northrop B-2 Spirit, which entered service in 1989, is in a direct conceptual lineage with Jack Northrop's wartime work, and when Northrop was shown a model of the B-2 shortly before his death in 1981. He reportedly said that it justified everything he had been trying to do. The Pentagon didn't suppress the XP-79B out of malice. Classification of experimental programs was standard practice, and a failed program with a dead test pilot was not something the Army Air Forces publicized in the closing weeks of a war the nation was celebrating winning. The aircraft simply disappeared from public discourse, not into a conspiracy, but into the bureaucratic silence that surrounds programs that don't succeed. What's striking, looking back at the documented record, is how much of the wartime experimental aviation landscape operated under exactly that silence. Programs that succeeded the P-80, eventually the Bell X-1, became history. Programs that failed became footnotes, or less than footnotes. The XP-79B is the latter. One prototype, one flight, one death, and then nothing. Harry Crosby's name doesn't appear in most aviation history books. The XP-79B doesn't appear in most accounts of American wartime aviation development. The Muroc test site went on to host the breaking of the sound barrier, the development of the U-2, the testing of aircraft that shaped the entire Cold War. The flying wing that crashed there in September 1945 was simply the ground that later history walked over. But it happened. The documents exist. The accident investigation report exists. The engineering specifications exist. And the question that the XP-79B program implicitly poses: how much risk is acceptable when a nation believes it is racing for technological survival, is not a question that ended with the Second World War. The classified experimental programs of that era were not aberrations. They were the foundation of everything that came after. Every black project, every classified test site, every aircraft that exists today only in declassified archives was built on decisions made in places like Muroc, by engineers like Jack Northrup's team, tested by men like Harry Crosby who understood that the aircraft might kill them and flew anyway. That's not mythology. That's the documented record. And there is far more of it still, waiting to be read. If uncovering the buried history of classified aviation programs like this one matters to you, consider subscribing. There are more stories in the record that have never been properly told.